On a Tuesday morning in October of 1987, a man named Gerald Kowalski stood at the edge of a gravel lot in Grundy County, Iowa, and watched 30 years of his father's life get sold off in 2-hour increments. The auctioneer's voice carried across the cold air like a radio signal cutting in and out, and every time the gavel came down, another piece of what his father had built disappeared into the bed of a stranger's truck. Gerald was 44 years old. He had driven 4 hours from Des Moines before sunrise. He had not slept, and he was standing there with $200 in his coat pocket, which was all he had been able to pull together on short notice, wondering if it was going to be enough. It almost wasn't. Let me tell you why. Let me tell you about Walter Kowalski first, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what his son found on that workbench. Walter Kowalski had come to Grundy County in 1951 with a Polish surname, a German work ethic, and $800 in savings that he had accumulated over 6 years of working other men's farms in Wisconsin. He was 28 years old when he bought his first 80 acres off a neighbor who was retiring, and he was 31 when he bought the adjacent 40 from the same man's widow. He farmed those 120 acres for the rest of his life, and he never once borrowed money to do it. That was the thing people in Grundy County remembered about Walter Kowalski. Not that he was the best farmer, not that he had the biggest operation, but that he had never once carried a note to the bank. In a county where the farm crisis of the 1980s had driven a dozen families off land they had worked for 3 generations, Walter's quiet, debt-free stubbornness looked less like old-fashionedness and more like prophecy. Walter died in the spring of 1987 at 64 years old, of a heart attack that took him between the barn and the house on a Wednesday morning in April. He was found by his neighbor Earl Steffen, who had come over to return a fence stretcher he had borrowed the previous fall. Walter was lying face down in the yard with his boots on and his cap still pulled down over his ears, and Earl said later that he looked like a man who had simply decided to lie down and rest, which was not like Walter at all, but which was also, in some way, exactly like him. Gerald was the only child. He had left Grundy County in 1965 to go to Iowa State, had studied mechanical engineering, and had spent the following 20 years working for a manufacturing firm in Des Moines that made agricultural equipment components. He was good at his job. He understood machines the way his father had understood soil, intuitively, precisely, without having to think too hard about it. But he had not come home. He had visited at Christmas and in summer had helped with harvest twice when his father's hired man had quit, and had otherwise lived his life at a comfortable distance from the farm and everything it represented. This was not a source of conflict between them. Walter was not a man who asked for things he couldn't have, and Gerald's absence was one of those things. But it was a source of quiet guilt in Gerald, the kind that doesn't announce itself but that you carry like a stone in your shoe. Always there, always slightly uncomfortable, never quite bad enough to stop and deal with. When Walter died and the estate was sorted out, it turned out that the 120 acres had already been sold quietly the previous year to a young couple from Marshalltown who wanted to expand their operation. Walter had done this deliberately and without telling Gerald, because he had known Gerald didn't want the farm and had not wanted his son to feel obligated to pretend otherwise. What remained was the farmstead itself, the house, the barn, 2 outbuildings, and a machine shed, on about 4 acres that had been parceled off from the sale. And what was inside those buildings was the question. Gerald had not been inside the machine shed in years. He had known his father kept things there, tools, parts, equipment that Walter had accumulated over decades, but he had not paid close attention to the specifics. When the estate attorney told him the contents of the shed would need to be liquidated, Gerald had agreed without much thought. He did not know what he was agreeing to. Not yet. Let me tell you about the week before the auction, because that's where this story actually begins. Gerald drove up from Des Moines on a Thursday to spend the weekend sorting through the farmstead before the estate sale company came in to catalog and price everything. He had expected it to be a melancholy task, going through an old man's belongings, deciding what was sentimental and what was just old. He had not expected it to take his breath away. The machine shed was a low, wide building with a corrugated steel roof and a concrete floor that Walter had poured himself in 1962. It smelled like oil and dry wood and something Gerald could not quite name, a smell that he later described as the smell of time, which sounds like a poet's answer, but which anyone who has spent time in an old man's workshop will recognize immediately. There were 2 tractors parked along the far wall, both older than Gerald. There was a workbench along the south wall that ran the full length of the shed, maybe 40 feet, and above it hung tools on pegboard hooks, wrenches, sockets, pullers, gauges, organized with a precision that made Gerald stop in the doorway and simply stare. His father had labeled every hook, not with tags or tape, but with a paint pen directly on the pegboard and Walter's small, careful handwriting. Every tool had a home and a name, and every home was occupied. But it was what was on the workbench itself that stopped Gerald cold, because laid out across that 40-foot surface, in various states of assembly and disassembly, was a collection that Gerald, who had spent 20 years in the agricultural equipment industry, had never seen assembled in one place outside of a museum. There were carburetors from the 1930s and 1940s, disassembled to their component parts and laid out on clean rags in sequence. There were magnetos, hand-cranked and battery-powered, from at least 6 different manufacturers. There were governor assemblies, fuel pump bodies, water pump housings, and a row of what Gerald recognized as Schebler carburetors in various configurations, some of them going back to the early 1920s. There were parts Gerald could identify immediately, and parts he had to study for a full minute before the function became clear to him. And at the far end of the bench, in a wooden case that Walter had built himself from oak boards and lined with green felt, was a set of precision measuring tools, micrometers, bore gauges, feeler gauges, that were as clean and calibrated as anything Gerald had seen in a professional machine shop. Gerald stood in that shed for 2 hours without doing anything. He walked the length of the bench. He picked things up and set them down. He opened drawers and found more parts, organized by type and size in hand-labeled cardboard dividers. He found notebooks, 4 of them, composition notebooks with black and white marbled covers, in which Walter had recorded, in his small, careful handwriting, detailed notes on every piece of equipment he had ever worked on, specifications, clearances, the particular quirks of particular machines, what had been wrong, and what had fixed it, and what had almost fixed it but hadn't, and why. Gerald sat down on a metal stool at the end of the bench and read for an hour. He didn't cry, exactly, but he sat there a long time. The problem was the estate sale company. They had come in on Friday, 2 men in a pickup truck with a clipboard and a camera, and they had walked through the shed with the efficient indifference of people who price things for a living. Gerald had watched them work. He had seen one of them pick up a Schebler carburetor, turn it over once, and set it back down with the kind of expression that means, "This is worth about $3." He had seen the other one look at the row of magnetos and write something on his clipboard without stopping to examine any of them individually. And he had seen the price they put on the workbench and everything on it. $200. The whole bench. Everything on it. Everything in the drawers beneath it. The 4 composition notebooks. The oak case with the precision measuring tools. $200. Gerald had stood there looking at that price tag for a long moment. He was a mechanical engineer who had spent 20 years in the agricultural equipment industry. He knew what he was looking at. He knew what some of those carburetors were worth to a restorer, what the magnetos would bring from a collector, what the precision tools alone would fetch at the right sale. He also knew something the estate sale men did not know and could not know, because they had not read the notebooks. He knew what his father had been doing in that shed for 30 years. Let me tell you about what Walter Kowalski had actually been building in that machine shed, because it is not what you would expect from a 120-acre farmer in Grundy County, Iowa. Walter had not been collecting parts the way some men collect things, randomly, sentimentally, because they cannot bear to throw anything away. Walter had been, in the most literal sense of the word, practicing. He had been teaching himself, over the course of 3 decades, to rebuild and restore the ignition and fuel systems of early agricultural engines. The engines that had powered American farming from roughly 1910 through the early 1950s, before electronics and hydraulics had made the mechanical systems of that era obsolete. He had started in the late 1950s, when a neighbor had given him a box of parts from a worn-out John Deere Model D that was being scrapped, and he had spent the following winter figuring out how the magneto worked. Not from a manual. He had eventually found a manual, but he had started without one, because that was how Walter approached problems. You look at the thing. You figure out what it's supposed to do. Then you figure out why it isn't doing it. By the time Gerald stood in that shed in 1987, his father had rebuilt, by the count in the notebooks, 247 ignition and fuel system assemblies for engines spanning 40 years of American agricultural manufacturing. He had done this for neighbors, for collectors he had never met who had found him through word of mouth, for a small museum in Cedar Falls that had been restoring a 1929 Minneapolis Moline, and for his own satisfaction. He had charged almost nothing for most of it. The notebooks recorded what he had been paid, and the numbers were modest to the point of being almost fictional. $5 here, $10 there, a side of beef once from a man in Tama County, whose grandfather's tractor Walter had brought back to life. Walter had not been doing this for money. He had been doing it because he understood these machines in a way that almost nobody else still did, and because he believed, in the quiet way he believed most things, that understanding was its own justification. Gerald knew all of this because of the notebooks. He had read enough of them on Thursday afternoon to understand what his father had spent 30 years doing, and he understood, with the clarity that comes from 20 years in the industry, that the collection on that bench was not worth $200. It was worth substantially more than that. Not just in dollars, though the dollars were real, but in knowledge. The parts were cataloged, the procedures were documented. The particular solutions to the particular problems of particular engines, accumulated over 3 decades of hands-on work, were written down in Walter's small, careful hand in 4 composition notebooks. This was not junk. This was a library. The auction was on Tuesday. Gerald had gone back to Des Moines on Sunday, had thought about it for 2 days, and had come back with $200 in his coat pocket. He had not told the estate sale company what he thought the collection was worth. He had not argued with the price. He had simply decided to be there when the gavel came down. Now, let me tell you about what happened at that auction, because it is not the story you might be expecting. Gerald was not the only person there who knew what he was looking at. The auction drew about 60 people, which was a reasonable crowd for a farm estate sale in Grundy County in October. Most of them were there for the furniture, the household goods, the small tools, the kind of things that move quickly at estate sales and that people buy for practical reasons. A few were there for the tractors, which were old but serviceable, and which attracted the attention of 2 or 3 men who farmed nearby and who could use a parts tractor. The machine shed contents were scheduled for mid-morning, after the household goods had moved. Gerald positioned himself near the workbench early. He had been there since the sale opened, watching, and he had noticed 2 other men doing the same thing, standing near the bench with the particular stillness of people who are trying not to look interested. One was a tall man in his 50s in a canvas work jacket who Gerald did not recognize. The other was younger, maybe 35, wearing a John Deere cap and carrying a notebook of his own, which Gerald found significant. Men who carry notebooks to auctions are not casual bidders. The auctioneer reached the workbench at 10:47 in the morning. Gerald knew the time because he looked at his watch when the auctioneer said, "All right, let's talk about this bench and everything on it." And the number stuck in his memory the way numbers do when you're paying close attention to something important. The auctioneer described the lot in the way auctioneers describe things they don't fully understand, with broad gestures and general terms. Assorted carburetor parts, magneto assemblies, various ignition components, tools, some old notebooks, measuring equipment in a wooden case. He started the bidding at $50. The tall man in the canvas jacket bid immediately. Gerald bid. The younger man with the notebook bid. The tall man bid again. Gerald bid. The younger man dropped out at $150. The tall man looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the tall man. The auctioneer called for $175. The tall man bid $175. Gerald bid $200. The auctioneer waited. The tall man looked at the bench for a long moment. Then he looked at Gerald again, and something in Gerald's expression, the absolute stillness of a man who has already decided, must have communicated itself clearly because the tall man gave a small nod almost imperceptible and did not bid again. The gavel came down. $200. Gerald Kowalski bought his father's 30 years of work for exactly what the estate sale company had priced it at, because nobody else in that lot understood what they were looking at well enough to go higher, and because the one man who might have understood decided, for reasons Gerald never fully learned, to let it go. Let me tell you about what Gerald did with what he found on that bench, because this is where the story stops being about an auction and starts being about something else entirely. Gerald loaded everything into his truck on Tuesday afternoon. The carburetors, the magnetos, the governor assemblies, the fuel pumps, the precision tools in their oak case, and the 4 composition notebooks. He drove back to Des Moines and carried it all into his garage, where it sat in boxes for 3 weeks while he tried to figure out what he was going to do with it. He had not bought it as an investment exactly. He had bought it because leaving it felt like a betrayal of his father, of the work, of the knowledge that was in those notebooks. He had bought it because he was a mechanical engineer who understood what it represented, and because he could not stand the idea of it being dispersed into the hands of people who would use the parts without understanding them and discard the notebooks without reading them. But sitting in his garage in Des Moines, in boxes, it wasn't doing anything either. So Gerald started reading the notebooks, all of them, from the beginning. It took him most of November. He read in the evenings after work, at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee and the particular attention he gave to technical documents at his job. But these were not technical documents exactly. They were something stranger and more personal. A record of a man teaching himself a vanishing skill, written in the voice of someone who assumed no audience, who was writing for himself alone, who was trying to understand something and was using the act of writing to clarify his thinking. Walter had made mistakes and recorded them. He had tried approaches that hadn't worked and written down why they hadn't worked. He had developed preferences for particular tolerances, particular materials, particular sequences of assembly, and had noted the reasoning behind each preference. He had, over 30 years, developed something that Gerald recognized from his professional life as a body of knowledge. Not a collection of facts, but an integrated understanding. The kind that lets you look at a problem you've never seen before and know, not guess, what's wrong and how to fix it. Gerald finished the last notebook in late November and sat at his kitchen table for a long time. Then he called a man he knew from his professional life, a man named Dennis Hartley, who ran a small restoration shop in Ames that specialized in vintage agricultural equipment. Gerald had known Dennis for years through industry contacts. He told Dennis what he had found. Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then Dennis said, "Gerald, I need you to bring those notebooks to Ames this weekend." Gerald brought the notebooks. Dennis read through them over a Saturday afternoon, sitting at his own workbench with a cup of coffee, turning pages slowly, occasionally stopping to hold a page closer to the light. Gerald sat across from him and watched. At one point, Dennis stopped reading and looked up and said, "Your father knew things that nobody has written down anywhere else. You understand that? This is not in any manual. This is not in any service bulletin. This is stuff he figured out himself." He went back to reading. When he finished, he set the last notebook down carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and said, "What are you going to do with these?" Gerald had been thinking about that for 3 weeks. He said he wasn't sure yet. Dennis said, "Whatever you do, don't let them sit in a box." Let me tell you about the winter of 1987 and 1988, because that's when Gerald Kowalski made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. He had been working at the manufacturing firm in Des Moines for 22 years. He was good at his job. He had a pension coming. He had a house with a 2-car garage and a reasonable life, and no particular reason to change any of it. He was also, at 44 years old, aware in the way that middle age makes you aware of things, that he had spent 22 years making components for machines that other people would understand and use and care about, and that he had never, in all that time, felt the particular satisfaction that he recognized in his father's notebooks, the satisfaction of a man who's doing exactly the work he was built to do. Gerald left the manufacturing firm in February of 1988. He rented a small commercial space in a converted farm building outside of Ames, about a mile from Dennis Hartley's shop. He spent 3 months setting up the space, organizing the collection from his father's bench, adding to it from sources he was developing, estate sales, farm auctions, collectors who were selling off parts they couldn't identify. He built a workbench along the south wall, the same configuration as his father's bench in Grundy County, and he hung his tools on pegboard hooks and labeled each hook with a paint pen, in small, careful handwriting that he did not realize, until he stepped back and looked at it, was nearly identical to his father's. He opened, in May of 1988, a one-man restoration shop specializing in the ignition and fuel systems of early agricultural engines. He called it Kowalski Agricultural Restoration. He had 3 customers in the first month, all of them referrals from Dennis Hartley. He had 11 customers in the second month. By the end of the first year, he had a 6-month backlog and had hired a part-time assistant. Now, let me pause here and ask you something, because I want you to think about what Gerald Kowalski actually did in that moment at the auction, and what it cost him, and what it gave him. He spent $200. He spent 22 years of a career that was comfortable and secure and completely wrong for him. He spent 3 decades of his father's accumulated knowledge that would otherwise have been dispersed into the world without a home. And in exchange, he got a second life that fit him the way the first one never had. That is not a small transaction. That is not a story about a lucky auction find. That is a story about a man who understood what he was looking at when nobody else did, and who was willing to pay the price to act on that understanding. But let me tell you about the part of this story that most people don't know, because the auction is not where it ends. Let me tell you about the tall man in the canvas jacket. His name was Raymond Fuchs, and he was 54 years old in October of 1987, and he ran a farm equipment dealership in Rhinebeck, about 12 miles from the Kowalski farmstead. Raymond had been in the equipment business his whole adult life. He had started working at his father's implement dealership at 16, had taken it over at 32, and had built it from a 2-man operation into the largest John Deere dealership in Grundy County. He drove a new truck every 2 years and wore Carhartt that still had the creases in it, and held court at the coffee counter of the Rhinebeck Co-op every Tuesday and Thursday morning, with the comfortable authority of a man who's been the most knowledgeable person in the room for so long that he has stopped noticing it. Raymond had known Walter Kowalski the way you know someone in a small county, not closely, but continuously. He had known Walter was a careful farmer who kept his equipment running and never came into the dealership for anything he could fix himself, which Raymond had always found mildly annoying, the way dealers find it mildly annoying when a farmer is too competent to need them. He had heard, vaguely, that Walter did some kind of restoration work on old engines, but he had not paid much attention to the specifics. When he heard about the estate sale, he had gone out of professional habit and mild curiosity, and when he had seen the workbench, he had recognized that some of the parts were interesting without fully grasping what the collection represented. He had bid to $175 and stopped, and he had told himself it was because the price wasn't right. But the truth, and Raymond was honest enough with himself to know this later, was that he had looked at Gerald Kowalski's face and seen a certainty there that made him uncertain. He had seen a man who knew exactly what he was buying, and he had realized in that moment that he did not know exactly what he was buying, and that this was a meaningful difference. Raymond thought about that auction for months afterward. He thought about it at the coffee counter at the co-op, and he thought about it driving between farms on service calls, and he thought about it in the particular way you think about things that are trying to tell you something you're not quite ready to hear. Let me tell you about the morning in March of 1989 when Raymond Fuchs drove to Ames. He had been hearing about Kowalski agricultural restoration from customers. Not complaints, but mentions. A farmer in Butler County, who had a 1941 John Deere B with a carburetor problem that the dealership service department had been unable to solve, had taken it to Gerald and gotten it back running perfectly in 2 weeks. A collector in Tama County, who had a 1935 Farmall F20 with a magneto that nobody could time correctly, had found Gerald through Dennis Hartley and had his problem solved in 10 days. Word was moving through the community of people who owned and cared about old equipment, and the word was consistent. If you have a problem with an old ignition or fuel system and nobody else can fix it, Kowalski can fix it. Raymond drove to Ames on a Tuesday morning in March and found the shop without difficulty. It was not hard to find. A converted farm building with a hand-painted sign and 3 old tractors parked outside in various stages of undress. He went inside. Gerald was at the workbench, working on something Raymond couldn't immediately identify, and he looked up when Raymond came in, but did not stop working. Raymond said he had heard about the shop. Gerald said he was glad to hear it. Raymond looked around at the workbench, the carburetors laid out on clean rags, the tools on their labeled hooks, the notebooks stacked at the end of the bench, and something shifted in his face. He recognized the organization. He had seen it before, at an estate sale in October of 1987, and he had almost bought it for $175 and hadn't. He said, "That's Walter Kowalski's bench setup." Gerald set down the tool he was holding. He said, "It is." There was a pause. Raymond looked at the bench for a moment. Then he said, "I've got a customer with a 1938 John Deere B. Carburetor's been rebuilt twice by my shop, and it's still not right. Runs rough above half throttle, surges, won't hold a steady governor speed. My best man has been at it for 3 weeks." Gerald said, "What carburetor is on it?" Raymond said it was a Marvel Schebler TSX. Gerald nodded slowly. He said, "Is the governor's shaft worn or is it the carburetor needle?" Raymond said he didn't know. Gerald said, "It's probably the needle seat." The TSX on the B has a needle seat that wears in a particular way. It looks fine on inspection, but it doesn't seal correctly under load. Your man probably rebuilt the carburetor correctly, but didn't catch the seat wear because it doesn't show up until the engine is under load and the fuel demand changes. He paused. There's a specification for the seat angle that's not in the standard service manual. My father worked out the correct tolerance about 15 years ago. It's in the notebooks. Raymond looked at him. He said, "How do you know it's the seat?" Gerald said, "Because that's what the B does when the seat is worn, runs rough above half throttle, surges, won't hold governor speed. That's the symptom. The seat is the cause. It's almost always the seat." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can you fix it?" Gerald said he could fix it in a week. Raymond brought the tractor. Gerald fixed it in 6 days. The farmer who owned it called the dealership to say it was running better than it had in 20 years, which was a statement Raymond had never heard a customer make about a tractor his shop had worked on, and which settled something in him that had been unsettled since October of 1987. Let me tell you about what happened between Raymond Fuchs and Gerald Kowalski over the following years, because it is not a simple story and it does not resolve the way you might expect. Raymond did not become Gerald's champion or his partner or his friend exactly. What he became was something more useful and more honest than any of those things. He became a referral source. When customers came into the Rhinebeck dealership with old equipment that Raymond's shop couldn't fix, and there were more of these than Raymond had previously admitted to himself, Raymond started sending them to Ames. He did this without fanfare and without apology, and he did not explain to his service department why he was doing it, which created some friction that Raymond absorbed without comment. What Raymond also did, and what took him longer to do, was go back to Ames on a Saturday morning about 6 months after the carburetor job and ask Gerald if he could look at the notebooks. Gerald said yes. Raymond sat at the end of the bench for 3 hours and read. He did not say much while he was reading. When he was done, he sat for a moment and then said, "Your father understood these engines better than anyone I've ever known, and I've been in this business my whole life." Gerald said, "I know." Raymond said, "I should have bid higher at the auction." Gerald said, "Yes, You should have. That was as close as either of them came to discussing what had happened at the auction, and it was, in the particular way of men who work with their hands and do not waste words, enough. Let me tell you about what Gerald Kowalski built over the following decade, because the shop in Ames was only the beginning of it. By 1995, Kowalski Agricultural Restoration had a staff of 4 and a waiting list that ran to 8 months. Gerald had expanded the space twice and had acquired, through a combination of estate sales, collector contacts, and a network of farmers and restorers that stretched across 6 states, what was arguably the most comprehensive collection of early agricultural ignition and fuel system parts in private hands in the Midwest. He had also done something that his father had never done, which was to write it down in a form that was meant to be read by others. Gerald spent the winters of 1993 and 1994 organizing his father's 4 composition notebooks, cross-referencing them with his own 7 years of shop experience, and producing what he called, with characteristic understatement, a technical reference for early agricultural ignition and fuel systems. It ran to 340 pages. He had it printed by a small press in Ames and sold it through the shop and through a network of restoration contacts. He priced it at $45. It sold out the first print run of 500 copies in 4 months. He printed 1,000 more. Those sold out in 8 months. The third printing of 2,000 copies sold steadily for years afterward, and Gerald received letters about it from restorers and collectors and agricultural historians in 22 states and 3 foreign countries. The dedication page read, "For Walter Kowalski, who worked it all out himself." Let me tell you about the afternoon in the fall of 1997 when a young man came into the shop in Ames. His name was Paul, and he was 22 years old, and he was Gerald's son, and he had just graduated from Iowa State with a degree in mechanical engineering, which was the same degree Gerald had gotten from the same school 32 years earlier. Paul had grown up visiting the shop, had spent summers there as a teenager doing whatever needed doing, and had developed, in the way that children develop things when they are around them long enough, an understanding of the work that was deeper than he knew. Paul sat down at the end of the bench, the same stool Gerald used, the same position Gerald had sat in at his father's bench in Grundy County 10 years earlier, and said he had been thinking about what came next. Gerald said, "What do you mean?" Paul said he had been looking at the fuel injection systems on the newer vintage equipment, the late 1950s and early 1960s diesel systems, the early LP gas conversions, the systems that were now old enough to be giving restorers problems but new enough that nobody had written the reference material yet. He said he thought there was a gap in the knowledge base. He said he thought someone should start documenting it now, before the people who understood those systems were gone. Gerald looked at his son for a moment. He thought about a Tuesday morning in October of 1987, and a workbench, and 4 composition notebooks, and a man who had spent 30 years working things out by himself and writing them down for no audience at all. He thought about what it had cost to almost lose that, and what it had taken to save it. He said, "You're right. Start with the LP gas conversions. There's a Farmall 400 coming in next week with a system nobody's been able to sort out. Work on it with me and take your own notes." Paul said, "Just like that?" Gerald said, "Just like that." Paul Kowalski spent the next 4 years working alongside his father, and the 4 years after that working increasingly on his own. And by 2005 he had produced the first of what would eventually be 3 technical references covering the ignition and fuel systems of agricultural equipment from 1950 through 1975. He dedicated the first one to his grandfather, whom he had never met, and the second one to his father, and the third one to the farmers and restorers who had brought their problems to the shop and trusted that someone there would understand them. The shop is still in Ames. Paul runs it now. Gerald retired in 2012 at 69, the same age his father had been when he died, and he spent his retirement doing what his father had spent his whole life doing, working on old engines in a shed, writing things down, charging almost nothing for it. He died in 2019. The obituary in the Ames Tribune ran 4 paragraphs and mentioned the technical references and the shop and his years in manufacturing. It did not mention the auction in Grundy County in October of 1987. Most obituaries leave out the moment that everything turned on. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end with Gerald or even with Paul. Let me tell you about the tall man in the canvas jacket, because Raymond Fuchs has one more appearance in this story, and it matters. Raymond sold the dealership in Rhinebeck in 2001, when he was 68 years old, to a regional equipment group that absorbed it into a larger operation and eventually closed the Rhinebeck location and moved the business to a consolidated facility in Waterloo. Raymond retired to a house outside of Rhinebeck with a workshop in the back, where he did, for the first time in his life, work that was purely his own. He had spent 40 years selling and servicing equipment. He had never, in all that time, simply worked on a machine because he wanted to understand it. He started, at 68 years old, restoring old tractors. He was not particularly good at it at first. He had the mechanical background but not the specific knowledge, and he found himself repeatedly running into problems he couldn't solve, ignition timing issues, carburetor behavior he couldn't diagnose, governor problems that didn't respond to the standard approaches. He drove to Ames 3 times in the first year. He bought Gerald's technical reference and read it cover to cover. He sat at the bench in the shop and asked questions that Gerald answered without condescension and with the particular patience of a man who has spent his life explaining things to people who are genuinely trying to learn. In 2003, Raymond Fuchs donated to the shop a collection of early agricultural equipment parts he had accumulated over 40 years in the dealership business. Parts that had come in on trade-ins, parts that had been left by customers who never came back, parts that had sat in the back of the Rhinebeck dealership since before Raymond had taken it over. It was a substantial collection. It filled a pickup truck. Raymond drove it to Ames himself and helped unload it, and when it was done he stood in the shop and looked at the workbench. Gerald's workbench, organized the same way his father's had been organized, tools on labeled hooks, parts on clean rags, notebooks stacked at the end. And he said, "I should have done this 20 years ago." Gerald said, "You're doing it now." Raymond said, "I keep thinking about that auction. I keep thinking about what I almost bought and didn't." Gerald said, "What do you think you almost bought?" Raymond thought about it for a moment. He said, "I think I almost bought 30 years of someone figuring out how to see what other people couldn't see. And I didn't know that's what it was." Gerald said, "Neither did I until I read the notebooks." Raymond drove back to Rhinebeck that afternoon. He kept restoring tractors until he was 74, when his hands started giving him trouble. He finished 7 of them in 6 years. He was not, by any objective measure, as good at it as Gerald or as Walter. But he was better at it at 74 than he had been at 68, and he was better at 68 than he had been at any point in his 40 years of selling and servicing equipment, because for the first time he was doing it for the reason it was worth doing, not for the transaction but for the understanding. He died in 2009. His son found in the workshop a notebook. One composition notebook with a black and white marbled cover, in which Raymond had recorded, in his own handwriting, notes on every tractor he had restored. What had been wrong? What had fixed it? What had almost fixed it but hadn't, and why? It was not as detailed as Walter's notebooks. It did not represent 30 years of accumulated knowledge. It was the beginning of something that did not have time to become what it might have been. But it was a beginning, and it was written down, and it was not lost. Paul Kowalski has it on the shelf above the workbench in Ames, next to his grandfather's 4 notebooks and his father's 7, and next to the technical references that all 3 generations of Kowalskis produced from what they learned. He has never met anyone who knew Raymond Fuchs. He found the notebook in the collection of parts Raymond donated in 2003, tucked into a box of magneto components, where it had apparently been sitting for 6 years without anyone knowing it was there. He read it on a Saturday afternoon in the shop, sitting on the metal stool at the end of the bench, the same way his father had read his grandfather's notebooks, the same way his grandfather had sat in that shed in Grundy County and understood for the first time what Walter had been doing for 30 years. When he finished, he set it down carefully and sat for a while. Then he put it on the shelf where it belongs, between the men who figured things out and wrote them down, and the men who almost understood what they were looking at and eventually did, and the long chain of work that connects them. Patient, specific, earned, and permanent, in the way that only true understanding ever is. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for someone to understand why they were worth saving in the first place.